I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter about the United States national debt and what it actually means, we have with us none other than Phil Luck, who is director of our economics program at CSIS and also our Scholl Chair in international business. Phil is an economist. He was the State Department's deputy economist. Welcome, Phil. It's great to have you back.
Thanks to be here.
So, Phil, I just want to, before we get into all the machinations of the national debt and what it means, what actually is it? Do people, what is the national debt?
Yeah, I mean, the national debt essentially is how much we're borrowing to fund our government that our government didn't raise money to spend. So, the way you want to think about this is these are basically the Treasury Department issues bonds that promise to pay back some amount of money in the future. And we use those basically to pay for things the government wants to spend. It's important to note that the Treasury Department does not determine how we spend money, but they're in charge of raising the money from the open market in situations where the government needs to. So every time we get to the debt limit, um, that's basically the Treasury needing the approval to continue to borrow for things we've actually already agreed to spend.
So the debt limit is where set by Congress is where we're supposed to stop. We're not supposed to spend any more than the debt limit, but of course we keep expanding it, raising it, the debt ceiling it's known as, because we can't pay for the programs that we want to pay for.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we've been in a situation now since, the late 90s where we've been spending more than we've been bringing in revenue, right? It's certainly expanded. I mean, the national debt expanded quite a bit during the Great Recession, where we had quite a bit of fiscal expansion to sort of soften the fall there. We, of course, have borrowed a lot to fund wars over the last, few decades. And then come COVID, we had another very large expansion of our fiscal debt as a result of safety net programs that we did because none of us could have jobs for a little while.
So Phil, I mean, national debt right now is $36 trillion. That's a lot of money. That's $36 trillion more than having a balanced budget, right? Or a balanced national debt. We used to run surpluses during the Clinton administration. We've been the largest debtor nation in the world since the end of the Clinton administration. Each president continues to spend more. Why is it so important for us to address the national debt?
Yeah, so I mean, we've obviously been hearing about debt for a long time. There's certainly a part of the Republican Party, which are sort of fiscal hawks, who have been warning about the challenges of debt for a long time. And just to put it into context, so it's $36 trillion. That sounds like a lot of money because it is. But I think the more useful way to think about the level of national debt is as a percentage of our GDP, our gross domestic product, which basically is if you're trying to make the comparison back to, your individual household, GDP is your annual income. It's how much you make per year. So our debt as a ratio of our GDP, we owe about 1.3% of our income, right? The debt to GDP ratio. So that's pretty high. It's above 100%, which generally are not, but we haven't really been above 100% before this recent period since basically World War II. So it's in the American experience, having a debt to GDP ratio above 100% and being in peacetime is different. Now, to your question about like what is it and why does it matter and why do people seem to wring their hands about it? The first thing I would say is not all debt is bad, right? So the first thing, like obviously, if you're a young person and you go to college and then you go to grad school and you get a law degree, like you might come out with a lot of debt, but no one would say that you're sort of, being financially irresponsible necessarily. You can borrow to invest, right? So the degree to which the United States government borrows to make big investments that only governments can, infrastructure, basic research, human capital through education, those are potentially not bad investments. Now, if you borrow significantly and consistently for consumption, meaning your everyday just going out to restaurants, drinks, and things like that, and you're living beyond your means, that's more of a problem, right? Now, okay, why is it a problem for us today? Taking this out of sort of the sort of analogy to a household.
Yeah,
Well,
because my
part of the
my
problem,
my middle son is spending more at college than he's certainly bringing in, and it's a problem.
yeah, so it's a problem, for a lot of us. I certainly had that phase myself. To put this in context, the other thing that that creates a problem with debt, not only do you have to pay it back at some point, but you also have to pay interest on it. And when we have debt, again, of $36 trillion, you've got to pay interest on that $36 trillion. And we're getting close to the point where the interest on our debt is equal to all discretionary spending. That's spending on things outside of sort of like welfare programs and safety net programs, right? That's all spending on military, that's all spending on education, that's all spending on science and research. All of that is equal to just what we pay annually on interest. So that tells you that, a lot of our tax money, the dollars that we send to the federal government, is just going to servicing, paying for the things that we didn't have income to pay for.
So this is sort of like having a credit card and revolving debt on your credit card.
Yeah. Now, the key thing here is one thing that probably won't happen to us, but certainly can happen to other countries is you can get into sort of a debt spiral where as you start to get more and more debt on your books, people get more and more concerned that you're not going to be able to pay it off. And they ask for a higher and higher risk premium. And then that higher premium makes it harder for you to service your debt. And then you get closer and closer, and eventually you have to default. Now, what we're starting to see here in the United States since April 2nd, Liberation Day, is a little bit of a risk premium put into the US borrowing. US treasuries are thought of or have historically been thought of as the safest asset or one of the safest assets in the world. So, when everything else is going haywire, returns on bonds, especially treasuries, usually go down because everyone flies to safety. This time, when the world went haywire, it was because of confusing U.S. policy, and people started to question, uh, the future policy in the United States and how that might impact the riskiness of investing in it.
So let's talk about the debt itself. If we're spending as much money on interest as we are on our entire discretionary spending, that's got to be really bad for the United States, isn't it? It sounds bad.
It's not ideal. I would say, obviously, we would prefer to be spending less on debt servicing. So, it's healthier for us to have a lower debt to GDP ratio. And because again, that just gives you more money to spend on other things. Now, that's not to say we should like tomorrow tighten our belts to the point where we cut all discretionary spending, because of course that'll have other macroeconomic impacts that would be detrimental to the long run growth of the economy. So I would say obviously there's a problem with sort of debt and debt servicing. One thing I want to point out though is that the great thing about growth, the problem with growth and sort of compounding interest rates is you have to keep paying more and more interest. The great thing about national growth is you can kind of grow yourself out of debt, right? If I grow my debt at 2% per year and I grow my economy at 2% per year, guess what? My debt to GDP ratio is staying the same, right? So growth is a really good way to sort of make your debt manageable. So that's one big thing here. And again, one of the reasons why the US is thought of as sort of a safe place to put money is really it's a bet on the US economy. You're basically people are saying, I know that the US will not only have sort of not only will be willing to pay back its debts in the future. It has that sort of we can make that promise and people can believe us, but we'll be able to pay our debts in the future. Which is to say, we'll have an economy that can let us do that. And again, I would say if we're thinking about managing our debt now, we absolutely should be trying to rein in our debt. Several people, in this sort of space are giving different targets. Uh, Ray Dalio is a very famous investor saying we should try to make a pledge of about 3% of GDP to debt ratio or to 3% debt. I think that would work quite well. We need to start reining it in. Unfortunately, we're kind of doing the opposite, right? So again, during the Biden administration, because of both COVID and then as a result of industrial policy, namely the IRA, we really exploded the debt. We made huge investments in both industries and people that exploded the debt because we didn't increase taxes to pay for those. Um, what's being considered now under the current Trump administration will do the same thing. It'll blow it up even further. So we're moving in the wrong directions. We need to start thinking about how to make this manageable. But one thing I'll add just there really quickly is um, we have an opportunity now to do this and not have it be super painful because interest rates aren't that high right now. People are still willing to lend us money. So we can have kind of a soft landing. We can slowly tighten our belts, slowly reduce spending and increase taxation and start to pay down debt. If you wait until markets force you to do it, it'll be way more painful.
So, who are all these countries that we're borrowing money from the most? Is it Japan? Is it China? Who are we borrowing from?
Yeah, so those are two of the biggest ones, of course. So between Japan and China, they're the two largest holders of U.S. debt. Between them, we have sorry, I put it out there. Between them, we they have about just about $2 trillion of U.S. debt. There's a lot of other countries as well, and there's also just private holders of debt as well. So one interesting phenomenon that's happened over the last few years is hedge funds have become larger and larger holders of U.S. debt. So as markets become larger holders, you're also going to be you're going to be more exposed to the animal spirits, let it, put it that way, of markets. So again, you have an enormous amount of debt out there. Any one large holder starting to change their thought process about the value or the credibility of US debt can start to put changes in the market.
So, a lot of people are thinking about tariffs these days. President Trump's certainly thinking about them, and his administration's pursuing them and doing negotiations, and things are changing quickly. But how does the trade equation figure into this? And also, you mentioned how we can grow ourselves out of debt, but currently our growth has slowed dramatically from even a few months ago. So, where are we now in that equation?
Yeah, so that's a really important point, which is, we had um, pretty a good policy environment and some good luck probably, and we were growing throughout 2023 and 2024 above expectations, close to 3% GDP growth, which is really quite high for an industrialized economy like the United States and historical records. Over the course of our sort of 200-year history, we've grown at about long run average of about 2% per year. So we were growing faster than average. And at that rate of growth, you again can sort of afford to borrow at a decently high rate. Um, the policies that we've seen again since April 2nd, even before that a bit, have really put a damper on the economy. We are most likely headed into at least a short a recession. And again, that's going to be lost time to where you're probably going to have some sort of or there would be cause for some sort of fiscal stimulus to get you out of the recession. We're not going to have much space for fiscal stimulus because we already owe so much money and that'll put you further into debt. So one thing I want to note there is, debt is not always bad, but the higher your debt is, the less space you have to do policies that you may need to do from a sort of cyclical macroeconomic standpoint.
So the kind of debt that we're running now is bad debt. What would be good debt?
Good debt, I would say for there's a few reasons you might have good debt. I would argue for a sort of long run growth perspective or from a business cycle perspective. From a long run growth perspective, there are plenty of things where governments can invest where markets just won't. There's not the right market incentive. So, basic research is always a really good example of this. Basic research is things like inventing the internet before anybody had any reason for it to exist, right? That's hugely valuable, maybe 30, 40, 50 years down the line, but there's not a really good market incentive. People aren't sure how it's going to become commercializable. Same thing inventing the microwave or any number of other things, right? So the government does an enormous amount of basic research funding. Um, the other, same thing with sort of investments in human capital. right? So, we all might agree that it's great to get a 4-year degree, but sometimes people don't have the money to do it, right? So being able to take out loans solves sort of that financial problem. So to the degree to which you're doing things like that and you're borrowing money to do it, these are pretty good arguments for doing it over the long run because it'll help your long run growth, and in long run that'll sort of pay things out. The other argument, and this is why our situation right now is I would call it bad debt, is from a fiscal business cycle stabilization standpoint. Meaning, look, markets, business cycles are volatile, right? When businesses freak out and they think a recession's coming, they pull back investment. That pullback investment reduces aggregate demand. That hurts consumers, who then also reduce their consumption, which further hurts aggregate demand, and we get a recession. What we found since Keynes wrote his work about a century ago, we've found that governments can play an important role here, stepping in to stabilize demand. Basically, they can be a demander for goods and services when the market pulls back. That softens the recession, and softens the sort of overall pain. Now, to do that, that basically means spending money when other people don't want to, and you're going to borrow money to do it. Now, to do that, though, and not run up deficits that are enormous, in the good times, you should be putting the brakes on the economy a little bit, or basically precautionarily saving as a government, a bit more, paying down your debt so that you have that fiscal space to put your foot on the pedal in the bad times. We've been in a situation where we've had record low unemployment for ages, low inflation, a rip roaring economy, and we're still accumulating debt. That's the real problem.
So, given all this, what are we going to do about it, and what are people proposing to do about it? And then the other question I have is the Trump administration telling us we need to endure some short-term pain for a longer-term gain?
Yeah, so I'll say 2 things here. What are we gonna do about it? I mean, I'm a little dismayed because, at least among politicians, there's seemingly very little appetite to address this problem. Now, this is gonna there a good balanced policy solution here would be a bit of everything, right? We need more revenue. We need to find more sources of revenue. We need to probably higher tax rates. We can do that across the income distribution or across asset classes. A million options on the table. We probably need to reduce spending a bit, right? Now, I would say that the efforts, of institutions like Doge, while maybe well intentioned, are really just nibbling around the corners. You know, the biggest part of the federal spending is our entitlement programs, right? If you don't have some reform to entitlement programs or some innovation in how those programs are operated, you're really just going to be not doing much at all. The last thing I would say, and to your point about sort of, this temporary pain, the temporary pain the administration is talking about is around sort of like trade policy, right? And they're saying, well, what we're going to do is we need to shock the system to reduce this trade deficit we have, right? The thing I want to point out, and this is incredibly important, is the trade deficit is the mirror image of our budget deficit, right? They are the same thing. So our trade deficit is not a function of bad trade policy by our partners. It's a function of bad fiscal policy by our government. Now, let me explain how that works. Basically, your budget, just like your household budget, same as the government budget, if you are spending, or so, sorry, I'm going to roll that back. So let me explain how that works. The United States government, sorry, one more time. Let me explain how that works. Normally, if you weren't the US economy, you can buy and sell goods in the global market. And that also means that you need to buy and sell currencies, right? You want to be paid back for whatever you sell into the market in your currency. The person paying for it has their own currency. You got to trade currencies in the open market. If you have a situation where a country is importing way more than it's exporting, well, they're trying to buy a lot of goods from the rest of the world, and they're trying to do it with their currency. So they're increasing the supply in the market of their currency, right? That would normally depreciate the value of that currency because, US consumers are out there trying to get stuff for dollars. Everyone's like, yeah, but everybody's trying to get stuff for dollars. Dollars aren't worth much. That'll push the price down. That would make all those imports more expensive because the dollar is depreciated, and it would make your exports more competitive, right? So the dollar moving around would help us balance our budget. And that's what would happen if the federal government wasn't borrowing so much. Okay, what's the connection there? What's the other thing people can buy with those dollars that consumers are trying to put in the market? They can buy treasuries. They can buy a really safe asset, right? So when I go out and I want to buy some nice pair of Nikes that's manufactured in Vietnam, right? I give the Vietnamese $100, and what they do is they turn around and buy U.S. debt for $100, right? So that keeps the demand for dollars high. So if we didn't do that, if the US government wasn't creating a new product to export, quote unquote, our debt, then this wouldn't be happening, right? So when we're thinking about this problem of debt and we're thinking about this problem of our trade deficit, they're the exact same problem. And the solution is here. The solution is we need to have more fiscal sanity.
So, Phil, when you're talking about cutting U.S. entitlement programs to help address this issue, you're really talking about Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. How is it possible and responsible to, adjust those in order to service our debt?
It's a really good question, and I know I'm kind of stepping on the third rail here. I mean, you can do it in a way that doesn't affect sort of current, or at least for Social Security, does not in any way affect current entitlees of the program, right? We can do this far off in the future. The other thing you can do, again, beyond, so we don't have to just think about in terms of reform, in terms of the allocations to those programs. We can raise more money from those programs, right? So again, we're living in a place where we're not being honest with the American people about the cost of the services that we're providing. Now there are opportunities, and Paul Simpson and others. There's been plenty of reports about um, ways we can update these programs. What I would argue is, well, even before anything like that, I would say we need to just have a national conversation about reforming these programs and ways in which we want to update the social contract. Because at this point, we're just not being honest with ourselves.
So, one of the things that's often said, in addition to talking about this third rail, is that the politicians view it as the third rail and want to continue to kick the can down the road because they don't want to deal with the short term pain, voters upset. Um, you know, how do we overcome that in our democracy if everybody wants to push it down the road?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that economists are not super good at answering. I would say it this way. Economists, when we're thinking about trying to change solutions, you need to change incentives, right? I would say right now, I would not um, bank on hope that there will be, uh, you know, people will do things in the interest of the country necessarily. They'll do things in their own personal interest. And the system we have right now, I would say, especially with campaign finance, um, politicians have incentives to favor the short run. So I would say if you want to change outcomes, especially in political cases, you need to change incentives.
Phil, let me ask you this. We've talked about our unique borrowing privileges, which is enabling us to sustain our economy. Does this call our unique borrowing into question?
So it challenges it, I would say. And to your point, that it's a unique privilege that I haven't really hit on quite as much as I should have. The central role of the dollar in the global financial system as really the safe asset means that it's both the method of exchange. Most transactions, even if it's between, say, you know, uh, Libya and Burkina Faso, they normally transact through the dollar because both the markets for the other currencies are not thick enough, so the dollar is a good intermediary. But then also because there's this huge supply of safe assets, U.S. Treasuries, that, by the way, you can always translate that asset into a dollar, which you can translate into other goods. That creates a demand for the dollar as the hub of this sort of global system. That creates enormous benefits for the United States, right? So that the French famously called this our exorbitant privilege. Um, that does a lot of things, right? It lowers the cost of borrowing. The United States can borrow in front of anybody at the exact same rate. The US is getting the dollar 10 times out of 10 if they want to invest in things, right? So that's an excellent benefit to us. um, it allows us to not really it allows us to borrow in our own currency, which most countries can't, right? So there is no way, unless we want to, for the US to default. Because if we wanted to, at the end of the day, we could just print more dollars and pay it back, right? Most countries can't do that. So we have that privilege as well. And the last giant privilege we have, and this is, I would say, potentially a privilege that we're overusing, is that the central rule of the dollar in financial transactions and as an asset means that our power to sanction individuals and non-state actors and states is a huge geopolitical club that we can use, right? And we use that quite a bit. But again, you lose that if you don't have the dollar as the central rule in the system. But if you had a world where the dollar was no longer, king, countries are going to do what you want quite a bit less.
And Phil, you mentioned printing money. What happens if we do start printing money? Does that cause rapid inflation?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, it's never quite as simple as just like turning on the money machine, as they say, or going burr. But there's a lot of question about how different types of monetary policy would affect inflation. So we had a debate about this during the aftermath of COVID, right? If you remember, there was the American Recovery Act and the CARES Act, which between them put upwards of $8 trillion into the system, and we also experienced inflation after COVID. Now, some people will argue that that was entirely a function of, unwise fiscal and monetary policy. Some people will argue that it was all supply shocks and we couldn't find toilet paper and we all were at home, so we wanted a Peloton. Um, first of all, the truth is nobody knows for sure, right? We all have just estimates of what happened, and the truth is probably based on the economic research, a bit of both, right? So we had pretty big expansionary and fiscal policy that probably played some role, especially in the latter part of the inflation and COVID. But we also had supply shocks that reduced supply and created inflation there. So the point I want to make here is like we never know exactly what's going to happen, but generally speaking, if you expand the money supply through loose monetary policy and you use debt finance fiscal policy, meaning the government borrows money to spend money, that's going to increase demand at the same time you increase the supply of dollars. That usually means there's going to be more dollars bidding after the same number of goods and prices will go up. So that's something we want to avoid. Now, the one thing I'll say really quickly is, before COVID, especially on the left, there was a sort of uh, growing appetite for a concept called modern monetary theory, which is this, it sounds fancy, but basically, this was the basic idea that we should never worry about the fiscal deficit because, as you said, the government can print money. And what the government can do instead of sort of restricting printing money, it can use basically price controls to stop inflation. Now, that is something that's never really been tried. And I would argue it's not a good strategy. Most economists would. But, that's a different way to do it. But using price controls as we did in the 70s is massively distortive and people do not like inflation regardless. So I think that's probably a bad idea, and most Democrats have kind of moved away from.
Phil, finally, something we haven't talked about yet, cryptocurrency. Do you anticipate that cryptocurrency or bit bonds, which are Bitcoin enhanced treasury bonds, to be an effective solution to helping solve this U.S. debt problem?
Yeah, so I don't think they'll really help the debt problem. I mean, the issue there is really that again, you know, debt. So debt is really just how much you're making versus how much you're spending, right? If we continue to spend more than we make, we're going to continue to have a debt problem. Now, there's going to be innovations in the vehicle that debt is, right? So again, it's whether it's a cryptocurrency or it's a treasury bond or it's gold, right? It doesn't really matter. These are essentially just promises to be able to secure goods in the future, right? So money is debt and debt is money. You just need some assurance that that asset can be traded back for something you want in the future. The nice thing about gold is it's only created in the heart of a sun, and we can't create it otherwise. So, like, that's a pretty good control mechanism. Bitcoin's similar, right? There's, some random guy somewhere made an algorithm for mining them. Not my cup of tea, but that's fine.
Phil, thanks so much. I think I'm beginning to understand this a little bit better, but I'm going to have you back to talk about it some more.
Anytime.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.